Good afternoon. I'm Doug Carlberg. I'm chairman of the San Antonio Manufacturers Association. This organization's been around 110 years. We're one of the oldest manufacturing organizations in the state of Texas, and we're pretty proud about that. I'm also the president and chairman of the Carlberg Consulting Group. Anyway, I am lucky tonight to have one of the leading experts on change management. It's Doug Berger, so you got a little bit of Doug squared here today. He is the founder and president of a nonprofit organization called Industry Reimagined 2030, which has a mission to revitalize U.S. manufacturing at the national level by scaling proven approaches to productivity and competitiveness. He is leading an initiative to broadly expand the development of both lean manufacturing and Industry 4.0, which is really smart manufacturing. So we're going to have to hear a little bit about where we're going in that direction by 2030. He has a decade of experience as a breakthrough consultant and educator. He has been a feature writer in Industry Week. He has been a national speaker on the Vintage Small Business Executive Groups. Doug is a senior advisor for Ashoka Social Entrepreneur, a nonprofit transforming economy in West Virginia and also tackling water security in Mexico. Doug is known for seeing the possibility and often hidden in plain sight, which I often do when I walk out in factories. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit out there that you walk by every day and miss. So with that, Doug, tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I started my career in tech, in developing advanced IT systems. And what I found, I worked for a really terrific director who really knew how to spot people's talent and deploy people's talent. And what he saw was that I had a knack for what we now call creative destruction. So if there was an area in IT that he was responsible for that he said, you know what, we really need to reinvent the technology and the systems and the processes in that area, that's where he would tend to deploy me. So I got started in IT in that way. And then after about 10 years in the tech side of IT, I moved to sales and marketing, where I headed up groups doing sales and marketing of advanced technology products, where the challenge was talking to people about technology that was not commonly used technology. And how did you get them to understand and appreciate that technology and see the benefits of it and then write checks for it? So that was my professional career there. My company decided to relocate, and I didn't want to go where they were relocating. And they gave me a nice package, and I said, I really like playing this game of going after things in a kind of transformational mode. So I struck out on my own and created a consulting company called Innovate, where I looked to take on business challenges that you couldn't deal with in a kind of off-the-shelf way. One of my first clients was AT&T, where there was a major development project that AT&T was doing for Japan, and it was way behind schedule. And there was $100 million riding on it if they could bring it back into schedule, which we did. In order to do that, we had to really challenge a lot of kind of the status quo about how projects got managed. We needed to create unprecedented collaboration between various sectors of AT&T, which, like any big bureaucracy, was used to kind of working within their own stovepipes and things like that. And at the end of the day, we brought the project in on time.
So how did you do that?
So there's a couple of things that in the way that I approach things. One is that there, now I got to get my thought on that. One is seeing the way people limit themselves in the way they're going after solving a problem. So they've got a certain kind of implicit way that they go after solving a problem. And lots of times that implicit way, when you're going after something more challenging, winds up being a limiting factor. So we would start out by literally standing in the future. And we would ask the question, okay, we're going to stand in the future. We're going to bring this project in on time. What are the big gaps between where we are today and standing in the future, having brought the project in on time? And it's very interesting because when you ask that kind of question from a future back point of view, people give you answers they actually didn't expect to tell you. So it is immediately provoking new kinds of thinking in that way.
That was about, what, back in the 80s or 90s?
That was back in the late 80s.
You know, what's interesting, that another approach that came out after that is the theory of constraints, where you start from the other end and go forward and identify the constraints. So when you add the two together, you get the best of both worlds.
You do indeed. Now, the nice thing about starting from the future is that it tends to bring out kind of the inspiration part. It tends to bring out, so people, when you unleash them, they tell you what they're really up to and what they'd really like to see happening. And then if you can channel that energy, you get some really great ideas. So that's one of the ways of achieving that. Another way of achieving that also is every industry, every company is kind of embedded in its own orthodoxies. So I did work with mining companies, and mining companies were embedded with the orthodoxy of the right way to do mining. And I did work with chemical companies that did batch processing, and they were embedded with the right way to batch process and ship chemicals and deal with non-valuated byproducts, if you will. And so every industry has its kind of orthodoxies. And I found out that I was really good at spotting those. And
Could you give us an example?
well, in mining, for example, there are a couple of orthodoxies. One, the way you measured a mine daily was you measured the amount of tons of ore that you got out of the ground. Tons of rock that you got out of the ground. Not tons of metal that was valuable, tons of rock. Okay? Well, it turns out then people optimized that measure. And a lot of what they took out of the ground had no value whatsoever. It was dirt. So when you shift the metric from tons of rock to, let's say, pounds of metal, and you assay it, statistically as you're pulling it out, and you evaluate it, and you say, let's go for pounds of metal, all of a sudden it's a game change. And people go, why are we going over there when there's no metal? Let's go over here where the metal is. The other thing was that people found that why are we bringing all this stuff, an underground mine, why are we bringing all this rock up to the surface? Why don't we take the rock from one place that has no value and put it in another place, all right, where we dug it out already, and only bring up to the surface value, rock that has good metal content in it. So you challenge some of these fundamental assumptions that people just didn't challenge before. They just went with, that's how we do things around here.
And you find a lot of that today in manufacturing. We've always done it that way, and you ask them why. Well, we've always done it that way. So, challenging what you're doing is really very innovative.
And that's kind of what got me into my nonprofit, Industry Reimagined. So I'd been working one company at a time, if you will, doing deep dives to improve the performance of a given company. And what I really said for the next era of my life, what I really wanted was I wanted to be making a difference at scale.
And you could be retired right now.
I could,
So-
except this dog ain't cut out for retirement,
A lot of us aren't. I'm still working myself, and I love what I'm doing, especially as chairman of the San Antonio Manufacturers Association. So tell us more about this Industry Reimagined 2030.
So I was, it troubled me through a lot of my years and decades of doing the kind of consulting work that I did, where we achieved really breakthrough performance, where in mining, for example, we changed the entire cost structure of a mine, and in doing that, saved the life of towns. Here we are in Texas. We were talking earlier about Arizona. Where mines are located is not downtown metropolitan areas. Mines are in remote places. Communities grow up around mines. And if the mine isn't flourishing, the community doesn't flourish, and the families don't flourish, and the people don't flourish. So it concerned me deeply as I saw what we were capable of doing in turning around situations. It troubled me deeply that we weren't doing that throughout the United States. And in fact, we were hollowing out communities and offshoring wealth and prosperity to families in China and not our own families. So when I decided that I wanted to take on a big challenge at scale, I looked at manufacturing and I said, why is it that we've got thousands of organizations trying to revitalize manufacturing? We've got SAMA trying to keep a strong manufacturing base in San Antonio. We've got lots of other manufacturing organizations like that around the country. We've got national organizations like AME and SME.
That's the Society of Manufacturing Engineers and the Association for Manufacturing Excellence, two great organizations that I'm currently involved with, and they've got a great mission.
And we've got lean, we've got technology, we've got people working over all these areas. Why isn't it? This is that kind of breakthrough question. Why is it that with all of those well-intentioned people, we haven't moved the dial on manufacturing? And manufacturing was continuing to decline. U.S. productivity statistically was continuing to decline. U.S. manufacturing competitiveness in the world standing was continuing to decline, and yet we had all of these great people and great organizations, very well-intentioned, working very seriously to reverse that. So it was with that breakthrough question in mind, all right, that I founded Industry Reimagined. And a number of insights came out, but one of the big insights was that a lot of the things we knew worked weren't being widely scaled. In the kind of innovator's dilemma and crossing the chasm, we would say that, the innovators knew to do it, and they were successful in competing against imports, and they were successful in keeping their companies here in the United States, all right? But by and large, the mainstream hadn't adopted those kind of proven things.
Or they've taken it over offshore. So I think what we learned after COVID, we were way too dependent, especially on China and offshoring manufacturing. And I think it was a major wake-up call for us that we really had to figure out how to reshore that stuff or nearshore it back here in the U.S. And this whole initiative is very timely. I know you and I know Harry Mosier on the Reshoring Initiative. Yep. He's got a calculator, and we spent a lot of time with him trying to beat the drum to really get people to figure out it's better to do it here, supply chain wise, lean, and very effective. And if you can really embrace Manufacturing 4.0 and your 2030 initiative, I'd like to hear more about where you see your journeys going in the next 10 years.
Well, again, I'm working with collaborative. So one of the things that we noticed from a breakthrough perspective is that these well-intentioned people tended to operate within their own stovepipes, what I talked about earlier with my experience with AT&T. So one of the key ingredients, one of the key missing elements was how do we create unprecedented collaboration. So, for example, in one initiative called Lean Reimagined, we're working to create unprecedented collaboration to develop some new approaches that can reach across the chasm to attract companies that may have dabbled in Lean, maybe using one or two approaches in Lean, but haven't really embraced Lean as a strategic tool for driving their productivity and competitiveness to be able to compete with China or Japan or Germany, for example, in advanced manufacturing. So that's one of the initiatives, and one of the ways that we're doing it is getting a brain trust together and then developing some new ideas and then taking those new ideas out to the existing channels and encouraging those channels to then scale some new thinking.
I think you're right on, Doug. I mean, the timing of this couldn't be better. I've got a few questions I'd like to ask you a little bit about your management style. Can you share a story in your past that had a profound impact on your leadership style itself? I know over time my leadership styles had to change quite a bit. Yeah. And I learned a lot from studying Toyota. Can you share a little bit about what changed in your life and your management style?
Sure. I was mentioning that my early on director, who noticed I had a talent for that kind of creative destruction, so he saw that I could walk into situations and see new possibilities that, we talked of that expression, hidden in plain sight. Other people just didn't see them. And I struggled with how to get that across to people. And one of the things that he pointed out to me, he said, Doug, you've really got great ideas. You ever wonder why those ideas are not being better adopted? And I said, yeah, it really troubles me, Al. And he said, that's because you don't realize it, but you're making people wrong for not seeing the possibilities that are obvious to you. Your talent is seeing things before others do, but you can't make them wrong for not seeing what you do. And I went whack on the side of the head. All of a sudden, I could look back over a lot of opportunities in my life and actually see where I had made people wrong and validated them, all right, rather than appreciate they were doing the best they knew how to do with the perspectives that they had, all right? And if I could give them some new perspectives that would make life easier, better, more successful for them, they would be appreciative of it, but not if I was making them wrong for the perspectives that had served them well up until that time. So that was profound for me. And now I can kind of catch myself. I'm human. I'll make somebody wrong, but I can now catch myself and adjust on the fly.
That's great. That kind of leads into my next question. In what ways do you encourage creativity and innovation when you're dealing with teams? And as a consultant, you had to learn how to do that. So what were the tools in your toolbox?
Great. So a couple of things. One, we needed to set ambitious goals that called for team and teamwork. The way I used to describe it was that a lot of people think they're playing on a team or one team, but they're really operating like a golf foursome. Everyone's got their own score. So versus we're a basketball, and basketball fundamentally calls for teamwork. So we need to create a game that calls for teamwork. So part of my consulting work has always been we need to set up the game. We need to set up the goal of the game. We need to set up the rules of the game. We need to kind of set up the kind of plays of the game in such a way that it really calls for teamwork. So that was one of the key things for me in that regard. The other was that I found out that you could actually train people to think creatively and train people to think in breakthrough terms. There was an English gentleman, academic, named Edward de Bono, who actually created a science of creative thinking. And that was so valuable for me because he himself was natively a creative thinker. But his real brilliance was he was able to develop tools by which he could transfer creative thinking and make it teachable and replicable. And so I then started to introspect and discover what were the things that I kind of naturally did and how could I create some tools and that were teachable and transferable and replicable. So I would then bring that to the team, the old expression, you're teaching somebody to fish rather than doing the fishing for them. So for example, now when I'm consulting or advising senior people like in my nonprofits, I'm always reflecting back on the principle that I used, the perspective that I brought to give them advice, and transferring that perspective to them such that they then could use that in a myriad of ways that I would never have reached out and seen. So those are a couple of the secret sauce ingredients.
Yeah, that kind of leads up to my last question here. What ways has your leadership style evolved over time? I know we've kind of danced around it a little bit, but if you were going to give a takeaway to people hearing this podcast, what could they learn and what could they apply with dealing with their teams to get the breakthrough thinking that everybody wants?
Okay. So when I was doing consulting, I was always hired by the CEO or COO to help achieve a very bold breakthrough outcome. And I would operate like I had to drive people to achieve that. And that would be the starting point all the time. And what I matured in over time was always having the breakthrough in mind, but starting where people were at. And that radically altered things. So I would go into a meeting and I would just say, where's everybody at? What are you dealing with these days? And then I would listen carefully to what they were saying and prompt a course of action that was consistent with the big, bold outcome rather than a course of action that might have just been very convenient and incremental. But it now starts from always going, where are you at these days? What are you dealing with? What are the issues? And seeing how if we stood out in that future of achieving that bold outcome, those issues wouldn't be there anymore.
It comes down to just being a good listener.
And then translating what you hear into actions that people see are beneficial for them to take.
I think you're right.
There's both parts of that.
Are really key here. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. You know, what got me really excited about...
I have to tell you, I'm just chuckling inwardly because as you're asking me these questions, I am like reflecting back on, and I'm literally seeing myself sitting in a room with some of the people that I used to work with. It's so vivid for me, some of the experiences.
The flashbacks are there. It's a learning experience. Life's a learning
really
experience.
Delightful.
Continuous journey. You know, one of the things, by the way, Doug's going to be one of our kickoff speakers tomorrow at the San Antonio Central Texas Conference and Trade Show. So I'm really kind of excited about hearing that presentation tomorrow. What really got him here in the first place, I heard a TED Talk of his when he did a conference up in New England, and it really talked about really the next generation worker, and I know that TED Talk probably lasted 30, 40 minutes, but what's your concern about the next generation worker that we need to really do the 4.0 and everything going forward? And I know you could probably talk on that topic 3 hours, but just what are your concerns and what are you seeing and what are the gaps that we really need to focus on?
I'm going to answer a slightly different question. I'm going to answer what are my concerns about the next generation manager managing the next generation worker.
That's a good question in itself.
You know, so what we've got is we have millennials, all right, that are digital natives. And there are a lot of people, like you and I are the white-haired guys, but there are a lot of people in the graying kind of area in their 40s, 50s, 60s, all right, who did not grow up as digital natives. And when you're trying to manage people that are digital natives, it's a whole different world, not just because of their technology savviness, but because they grew up in a very, very different kind of cultural world. My son and his friends would sit on the couch, all right, watching TV, and rather than talk to one another, they would text each other, sitting next to each other, sitting on the couch, all right? My daughter works for a company, and their whole primary method of communication, all right, is group chats. So there's as a manager, and you grew up pre-COVID, having meetings, people are in the meeting together and all of that, and now it's a virtual world. It's a very different challenge now for the manager who didn't grow up in that world to really appreciate the worldview and the competencies that the younger generation is bringing to the party. And, tomorrow I'm going to talk about lean, and one of the things I'm going to touch on is how the digital age is transforming how we go about doing lean. When we look at Industry 4.0 and sensors and data analytics and things like that, I remember, I go back far enough to remember when Excel spreadsheets came out and how that transformed the world of finance. So we've got, and if you didn't grow up in that world, you had trouble adjusting. So we need managers. The challenge is having managers who, A, they themselves can adjust, and B, they know how to manage a kind of multi-generational workforce of millennials and people in their 30s and people in their 40s that have very, very different seminal experiences, and to say nothing of the multicultural and all of that other aspect of things. So for me, the challenge is more a management challenge than it is a worker challenge.
And that's a brand new skill set that we're all going to have to learn. Well, Doug, thank you so much for being part of this podcast. Here again, the San Antonio Manufacturing Association really appreciates you taking the time and coming and joining us. And these topics we could talk about for hours. Yep. Thank you so much, Doug.
My pleasure. Thanks again, Doug.